Welcome to the Warwatch podcast, a 6-episode series from the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights, a joint centre of the University of Geneva and the Geneva Graduate Institute.
Hello and welcome to the Warwatch podcast. Over 6 episodes, we examine conflicts that demand your attention, bringing you expert documentation, legal analysis, and the concrete actions you can take. Warwatch is the Geneva Academy's interactive online portal where you can explore conflicts and track international humanitarian law violations for those specific conflicts. Today, for episode 5, we focus on Ukraine, but not the full-scale invasion or territorial battles. Instead, we're examining a disturbing pattern: thousands of drone attacks on civilians across southern Ukraine. In 2024 and 2025, the UN Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine investigated these attacks. What they documented raises urgent questions. How is this commercially available technology enabling systematic attacks on civilians? What does this mean for international humanitarian law, and where does responsibility lie? I'm Juliette Graff, and joining me today are 2 very special guests. Commissioner Pablo de Graef is a member of the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, which is the body mandated by the UN Human Rights Council to investigate violations of international humanitarian law and human rights in the conflict. The Commission conducts investigations, interviews victims and witnesses, and documents violations to establish accountability. We also have Anna Greipel, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Law Faculty of the University of Geneva. Her research focuses on emerging technologies and international humanitarian law, and she'll exceptionally be our legal advisor today. Commissioner, could you please start by setting the scene for us? What's happening in southern Ukraine, and what was the scope of your investigation?
We started with an investigation across the Dnieper River, and this is in Kherson Province. Then we expanded the investigation, and by October 2025, we could report on an area that was 300 kilometers long and affecting 3 different regions of Ukraine. Once again, concentrating on the use of drones in order to launch these attacks across the river. So that will be the main focus of my interventions today.
Anna, could you quickly jump in and ground this legally for us?
Yes, it's important to remind our listeners that the incidents that we will be discussing today took place, as just said, on Ukrainian territory in a context of an international armed conflict between Ukraine and Russia that began in 2014, along with belligerent occupation by Russia of these parts of Ukrainian territory. There is also evidence suggesting that North Korea has been involved as a co-belligerent alongside Russia, but this will less be the focus of today's discussion. From a legal perspective, this is important to ground in and know that it's context of an international armed conflict, because that means that international humanitarian law, or IHL, applies here. International humanitarian law established the rules and principles for armed conflict, specifying what parties can and cannot do.
Could you explain to our audience in a bit more detail what drones are and how they relate to international humanitarian law?
So technically, drones are unmanned vehicles used usually remotely controlled that can operate on land, in the air, or even underwater. They can range from sophisticated, very heavy systems equipped with cameras, infrared sensors, and advanced navigation softwares to small commercial available drones, like the ones that one can buy online or in stores. At their core, drones are, in a sense, just a combination of technologies that can be adapted for a wide range of uses. And I think it's important to keep that adaptability in mind, because it's exactly also what makes the line between civilian and military drones increasingly blurred. I think it's also important when we speak about drones to clarify right away that drones are not the same as autonomous weapon systems. Some drones may indeed be armed and equipped with AI systems to operate autonomously, meaning to select and engage a target without any human intervention, but the ones we will be discussing today are essentially remotely controlled by human operators. Now, just to make the connection also to how drones relate to international humanitarian law more broadly, I think it's important from the outset to know that drones are not unlawful per se, but their use is tightly constrained by some fundamental principles. Among others, the principle of distinction, where parties to a conflict must always tell the difference between civilians and combatants and between civilian objects and military targets. That means that when a drone is used in an attack, it can only target combatants or military objectives. We have then also other principles like proportionality and precautions in attack. But what we need to keep in mind is that these rules apply to anyone planning, deciding on carrying out those attacks, and the key takeaway being to assess whether a drone's use is lawful, one has to closely look at how they are actually used. And that's why collecting, verifying, and analyzing evidences such as the Commissioner's report does is so critical to understand the impact of drones' use on compliance with IHL.
Thank you, Anna, and already so many interesting questions raised. And thanks for making that distinction between autonomous weapons and drones. I feel like that's a distinction that we often see blurred. And it is striking that not all of these are military-grade weapons, that they can be consumer products that one can also buy. That's a crucial point that we will also come back to later on. But for the moment, I'd like to move on to the documented evidence and get into those details. Commissioner, what did these attacks look like on the ground for civilians? Could you tell us a bit more?
Yes, so I think that what they end up producing is a state of generalized terror, because the attacks on particular localities along this 300-kilometer stretch of the river are so frequent, so widespread in the legal sense, so systematic, that it makes life very, very difficult for the population. Because the targets have been, for the most part, civilian people walking on the street, but also facilities that are essential for everyday life. For example, attacks on pharmacies, attacks on humanitarian distribution centers, attacks on public transport, buses, taxis, private vehicles. So very gradually, what this leads is to people finding it necessary to move to places that are not under such attacks. And in that sense, this may be a case of a deliberate effort to forcibly displace a population, in which case that would constitute a crime against humanity. What we were told by witnesses and victims that we interviewed is, again, the state of constant fear, that you have drones pursuing you as you walk down a street, for example, and you try to hide, and the drone hovers above you until you come out of your hiding place. and then an explosive is released and people are either injured or killed. So, the mayor of Kherson, for example, has said repeatedly that the city is becoming unlivable because of the drone attacks. But there is an element of terror that is also associated with the fact that the drones attack people at home as well. And this is a perfect illustration of multiple sequential attacks on the same civilian infrastructure. And let us all keep in mind that the operators are receiving very accurate video feed, and therefore, for example, they can identify what's a civilian home versus other types of objectives that may be more military in nature. So people at home, for example, in private homes, first drone throws an explosive which creates a hole in the roof of the house. Then a second attack takes place, usually with incendiary bombs or incendiary materials that is thrown precisely through the hole in the roof created by the first attack, therefore setting the house on fire. So not even in their private residences are civilians free of the fear of being attacked. So in the period from July 24 to October of 25, local authorities in Ukraine pointed out that more than 3,000 homes, private civilian homes, were destroyed in this fashion. It is also worth pointing out that the attacks include infrastructure that is absolutely crucial for everyday life. So, for example, attacks with drones on electrical stations and substations, which set them on fire and destroys them. The lack of electricity, of course, is frequently accompanied by a lack of clean water. Because the pumps that distribute water in many localities are electrically driven. So, the point is that the terror is not simply inflicted on people that take the risk of going to public spaces. The terror includes attacks on private residences. So there is no escape from this. And the text that accompanies the videos that are posted, of course, emphasize this point, that there is nowhere to hide, that people will be chased and hunted down, and encouraging them to leave the areas under attack.
And we often hear that drone operators have real-time video feeds showing exactly what they were targeting. How did that footage factor into your investigation?
It was a critical aspect, and in a certain sense, the same technology that enables the commission of the crimes is the one that enables the investigations of those very crimes, because the video feeds that the operators receive, again, as you say, in real time, which allows, for example, for the distinction between military and civilian targets. There is no room for confusion given the inbuilt camera that the drone has, and that the operator is receiving in real time. We have, for example, footage of attacks on ambulances. And ambulances, because obviously they are part of medical system broadly conceived, have special protection under international humanitarian law. And there is absolutely no question from the footage that it was the ambulance itself that was being targeted, often in repeat attacks.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, this same technology that enabled the attacks also documented them, which there's a bit of an irony also there. And Anna, could you respond to the commissioner's description of these operators watching their video feeds in real time and deliberately targeting civilians and other protected persons? What makes drones specifically problematic from a legal and humanitarian perspective?
Well, I think the evidence shows that in many cases the way the drones were used, so it's really the way they were used, simply did not comply with core rules of international humanitarian law. And what's striking is that it's often not even about issues of whether the attack was proportional, so whether civilian harm was excessive compared to expected military gain. In many incidents, the problem was fundamental. Operators simply failed to distinguish between combatants and civilians. And I think even more concerning is, as well described, in several instances, there are strong signs that the attacks were deliberately aimed at civilians and civilian objects, as well as medical units or personnel that are afforded special protection under international humanitarian law. And such actions are simply strictly prohibited under international humanitarian law and amount to war crimes. Drones are often promoted for not only this full, transparent, big picture of the ground, but also for their precision strikes. And we forget that the cumulative effect of repeated operations, especially increasingly we observe those taking place in urban areas where there is a real intermingling between civilians and military, can create a wave of destructions that undermines the very protection IHL is meant to provide. Even if each individual strikes appears lawful, the overall pattern of harm raises serious legal and ethical concerns.
Yes, thank you, Anna. And we really see how this technology really creates a fundamental shift from traditional warfare. Commissioner, you previously painted a very vivid picture to us about the lived experience of those that are being constantly surveilled from above, which to me really brings a completely different kind of fear in play. From what you described, daily life becomes impossible, and it's almost as if people are waiting for cloudy days to be able to go outside. I mean, the climate of fear that is created is terrifying. And there is another dimension to this, which is the digital terror that is also created. You mentioned earlier that perpetrators were posting videos of these attacks on social media platforms such as Telegram. How did that factor into this terror campaign?
I can read you a post on Russian Telegram of February the 3rd, 2025. That reads, Kherson, red zone. Civilians did not yet understand that they do not have long to live with such an approach to security. But everyone chooses when and where to die at war. This is a quote from their postings. So the whole vocabulary is one of constant threat. So for another quotation from a Telegram post on the 30th of July reads, Civilians moving within the red zone do so at their own risk. By definition, any movement is a target. This is what it says. And then, because the videos are fashioned along the lines of video war games with rock music, heavy metal music, and points scored, as it were. It all gives the appearance that this is almost like a game for the operators. So, for instance, on a video disseminated on the 15th of September 2024, it shows an explosive being dropped on a person in civilian clothes. And the accompanying text reads, "Mission accomplished, target hit." Another one later on December 1st, 2024, reads the text that accompanies the video of a drone attack on 3 civilians that were repairing a roof. And the drone drops an explosive, and the text reads, once again, everything that moves will be destroyed. So it's a particular type of vocabulary and a particular type of visual framing of the attacks. And if I may add one particular type of case that we have, of which we have several, but one particular situation is one in which civilians are hurt by explosives that are dropped on them by a drone, and they are visibly hurt. The drone stays in the area in which the civilian lies wounded, and waits for first responders to come, for example, ambulances, and they drop an explosive on the ambulance or prevents the ambulance from reaching the wounded civilians.
That's horrifying. Thank you for sharing these cases and also reading out those posts. The language is just chilling, and I guess this also reveals a lot about the mindset of those people that are operating these drones. And we will get back to that in a bit, because I would like to ask you about those people. But before that, Anna, let me turn to you. And from what the commissioner described, both this physical violence and this intense psychological warfare with the surveillance, the videos, the threats, how does international humanitarian law respond to these different dimensions of civilian harm?
As you stress, the evidence of just presented really highlights how civilian harm is extending far beyond physical injury, encompassing a significant psychological dimension. IHL prohibits clearly acts or threats of violence, with the primary purpose of which is to spread terror among the civilian population. And the testimonies just documented strongly suggest that the violence, threats, and dissemination of intimidating content were designed to instill fear at scale. This kind of conduct falls squarely with the prohibition of terrorizing civilians. Closely linked to this climate of fear is also the fact that individual civilians feel over time forced to flee their homes, and where the displacement under IHL, where displacement is not justified by imperative military reasons or the security of civilians themselves, this simply amounts to an unlawful forced displacement prohibited under IHL. Now, IHL also protects civilians against outrages upon personal dignity, including humiliating and degrading treatment. It also prohibits exposing individuals, whether civilians but also prisoners of war, to insults and public curiosity. And I think this is important to highlight, where in today's digital environment, this widespread sharing of images and videos of vulnerable individuals on social media can violate these very protections, particularly when such content is exploitative, degrading, or intended to humiliate the civilians, or even personnes hors de combat. That said, parties to a conflict must not encourage or incite others to violate IHL. So I think that obligation sits quite strongly on the states involved in the incidents we've discussed. And this is particularly relevant in the context of online platforms where messaging, information, or calls to action can enable or even amplify unlawful conducts, not only by individuals acting on behalf of the state, but also normalize it and enable groups or other individuals to take part in this. To say that I think it's clear that IHL is not limited to regulating physical forms of harm. It also addresses the psychological and informational dimension of harm by protecting civilians from being terrorized, coerced, humiliated. And these obligations, I think it's important to stress that they bound all states and even non-state armed groups. The challenges today is, I think, less than about the existence of the rules, but more about ensuring that they are properly interpreted and essentially applied in the context of today's armed conflicts.
It's good to see that international humanitarian law is catching up to psychological warfare as a weapon. And it's so essential because from what you've both been describing throughout this discussion, the terror isn't just a side effect, but it's really the point. And I'd like to touch upon the private sector. Based on what you documented, Commissioner, how were these companies involved?
There are two different types of companies that are mentioned in our reports on the drones attacks. The first one is a Chinese company that goes under the initials DJI. There's a particular type, the Mavic 3 quadcopter series, seems to be of a generalized use. But nevertheless, as I said, in the evidence that we have, this is a sort of arm of choice. The Russian Federation also uses different types of drones, particularly something called the BT-40 quadcopter, and a fixed-wing Molniya drone, both of which are Russian-produced. The explosives are usually attached to the drones, and that may include grenades, mortar rounds, different type of ammunition, so-called butterfly mines, repurposed anti-tank mines, as well as improvised flammable or explosive substances that are carried in plastic bottles by the drones and dropped over their objectives. This, for example, is the case with the attacks on private residences that I mentioned before. The second type of company that has figured in our report are the platforms on which the videos are posted. And Telegram is the most frequent platform for the posting of such videos. So without making any attribution of direct responsibility, because we did not undertake that type of investigation in either report. It is clear that products that are commercially available and that are produced by private companies are used in the attacks, and that then information is disseminated about those attacks, including the threatening messages that I mentioned before, through um, social media platforms, and again, in particular, Telegram.
And so, Anna, from a legal perspective, what responsibilities do companies like these, like DJI and Telegram, have?
Well, under IHL, these companies are not the primary duty bearers, which binds essentially states and parties to armed conflict. That doesn't mean that they are not also restricted in ways they operate during armed conflicts. But still, the duty essentially sits with the states, who have the duty to ensure that these private entities within the jurisdiction do not contribute to violations of IHL. So basically, they have to take measures to prevent IHL violations, take feasible measures to do so, and these may include measures that are necessary and feasible to make IHL known, for instance, to employees of private tech companies, and demand that they respect IHL. States should also regulate corporate conduct through, be it export controls, sanctions, but also domestic criminal law. And additionally, the state must take measures necessary to suppress IHL violations and prosecute those who commit war crimes. And this may include private companies' staff.
I like to end each episode with a forward-looking question. Commissioner, you have unprecedented evidence here. Perpetrators filmed their own crimes. They posted them online. So this may contribute to the idea that international humanitarian law is really touching at its limits. How do you see ways, whether through your work or others, for bringing back a culture of compliance within international humanitarian law into contemporary armed conflicts like Ukraine?
Even in times of conflict, not everything that you can do should be done or is allowed. That the value of the framework, which does impose limitations on what armed forces can do, is so important, of such overriding importance, that the limitations are justified by the aim of humanizing war. And obviously, I think that systematic violations of the sort that we are talking about in this act of aggression, which involves, let us not forget, one of the permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations. Those types of systematic violations of the principles of international humanitarian law have spillover effects. If one of the permanent members of the Security Council is involved in these violations, there are many countries at different levels of power and development, to use broad terms. Makes it much more likely that they say, well, if those that have powerful, both in reality, given wealth, size, and status in the international community, violate the principles. So why should we respect them? So it's international humanitarian law as part of the human rights architecture that encompasses the globe depends on acts of self-restraint. And the self-restraint, of course, is more likely to take place when there is more or less generalized compliance. But when there are overt and deliberate instances of violations, that increases the price on everyone else to respect the principles. So it's a complicated issue.
This has been the Warwatch podcast, a series from the Geneva Academy exploring armed conflicts and the laws that seek to limit their impact. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss the next one. The Commissioner's full reports from May 2025 and their October 2025 report to the UN General Assembly are available on the UN Human Rights Office website at ohchr.org. You can find the full legal analysis and documented violations on the Warwatch portal at warwatch.ch. Ukraine is one of the conflicts that we are tracking. I'm Juliette Graf. With me today was Commissioner Pablo de Greif from the UN Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine and Anna Greipel, postdoctoral researcher at the University of Geneva. Thank you for listening.
You've been listening to Warwatch, a podcast from the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights, a joint centre of the University of Geneva and the Geneva Graduate Institute. Find us at geneva-academy.ch and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.